living in the first person after narcissistic abuse. Do you feel bossed around by other people's expectations? Do you get extremely anxious or blank when making a decision for yourself? Do you find yourself living through the eyes of others instead of your own? Well, the scapegoat child to a narcissistic parent was deprived, devalued, and trapped. They were deprived of the emotional nourishment needed to develop. They were devalued so that the narcissistic parent did not have to feel devalued. And they were trapped by the parent's attacks on their sources of happiness outside of the family. Such abusive treatment triggers the scapegoat child's flight response. The child's instinct is, of course, to get away from someone who seems intent on hurting them. This is only adaptive, though, if there's another caregiver to flee to. When the only viable parent is also narcissistically abusive, then the child is really stuck. Yes, the child wants to get away from the source of harm, but the child cannot survive if getting away leaves them parentless. Under such conditions, the scapegoat child has to override their instinct to flee. And this means finding a way to make being deprived, devalued, and trapped seem tolerable. And one way the scapegoat child can do this is by caring more about what the parent thinks of them than what the child thinks of themselves. Now, once that's achieved, all that matters is the parent's opinion. If the parent is unhappy with the child, then the child is unhappy with themselves. If the parent is happy, then so is the child with themselves. At this point, the scapegoat child has a reason to now stay close to the narcissistic parent who is also hurting them. Another problem, is that what makes the narcissistic parent happy is often what makes the scapegoat child suffer. And what makes this parent unhappy is often the scapegoat child's growth and happiness. Well, in today's video, I explain how the scapegoat child overrides their instinct to flee a narcissistic parent. And I submit that the child does this by caring more about what the parent thinks of them than what the child thinks of themselves. And I'll describe how this strategy helps the child survive. As adaptive as this strategy is, it later robs the scapegoat survivor of living their lives in the first person. And last, I'll discuss how therapy can be a way to learn that relationships no longer require you to adopt the other's mind as your own. My name's Jay Reed, and I'm a licensed psychotherapist in California, and I specialize in recovery from narcissistic abuse. In my personal and professional experience, I've worked to identify the fundamentals to the process of recovery. And this has led me to what I call the 3 pillars of recovery. Pillar number 1 involves making sense of what happened so that you can discover it was not your fault. Pillar number 2 is gaining distance, whether psychological, emotional, or even physical, distance from narcissistic abusers, and closeness with safe people. And pillar number 3 is living in defiance of the narcissist's rules. I think it's also essential to find and participate in communities of people who can get, validate, and support you along this path. And I've seen and experienced large improvements in quality of life over time after applying these pillars. Today's video falls under pillar number 3, living in defiance of the narcissist's rules. And if you were a scapegoat survivor to a narcissistic parent or partner, then I encourage you to check out my free ebook on the topic. It's called Surviving Narcissistic Abuse as the Scapegoat, and it goes into other important aspects of what it's like to be in the shoes of the scapegoat child or partner of the narcissistic abuser, whether it's from self-limiting beliefs about yourself that you had to adopt in order to survive, to why the narcissistic personality is so geared to put those closest to them down. This ebook can help you realize how none of this abuse was your fault, but was rather the product of the narcissist's psychological and emotional problems. You can find the link to the book in the description below or by clicking here. The threats posed by the narcissistic parent. The narcissistic parent relates to the scapegoat child as if that child is worthless. And in order for the child to share a reality with the parent, the child must adopt this worthlessness as an identity. It is searingly painful, of course, to have to live as though one is worthless. Our natural reaction to such treatment is to get the heck away from it. Well, the child in the role of scapegoat to the narcissistic parent often does not have this luxury. If the other parent is emotionally unavailable and or absent some other way, then the child must find a way to stay attached to the narcissistic parent. And the child has to become wary then of their own flight instinct because it leads them towards being parentless. Being without a parent can be akin to psychic annihilation to the very young child. There would be no one to know the child who has yet to fully know themselves, and this can feel like an internal obliteration that must be avoided at all costs, again, for the young child. So the scapegoat child must find a way to psychologically stay with the parent who is also hurting them. Staying in this fashion involves the scapegoat child overriding the impulse to flee from harm. And this is a tall psychological order. The scapegoat child's solution to stay with the narcissistic parent. The scapegoat child stays attached to the narcissistic parent by adopting the parent's mind as the child's own. The child can reason, often unconsciously, even non-verbally, that the parent is always right. This helps them avoid the parent's wrath for challenging the parent's authority. Furthermore, if the parent is always right, then their opinions, feelings, and thoughts are going to be the most important to the child. These conclusions lead the scapegoat child to care most about what the narcissistic parent thinks of them. The child's own thoughts about themselves seem far less important. And this amounts to adopting the parent's mind as the child's own. Now when the parent attacks the child's character or behavior, the child knows they deserve it. If the parent is always right and they are devaluing the child, then the child must be valueless. And this strategy has several adaptive benefits for the child. First, it overrides the child's flight response. The parent is no longer the source of harm. The child's badness is what causes the child harm. The parent is just reacting to how the child is. Now the child wants to flee themselves in favor of the narcissistic parent. The child is now aligned with the parent against the child's self. I want to introduce another fictionalized case example. Hector had a narcissistic mother and an emotionally remote enabler father. His mother's stance towards Hector always seemed to be, stay close to me so I can keep hurting you. His mother regularly screamed at him for pseudo-offenses around the home. However, he could not know that this was what was happening at the time. He needed his mother too much, despite how abusive she was towards him. Hector had found a way to keep himself a bit safer in the 5th grade by asking himself what his mother would want him to do. He would police himself to not do or be anything that could cause her to be upset with him. It just hurt too much when she yelled at him. He had to find a way to limit it. Later in middle school, Hector was confused by his mother's refusal to let him see and enjoy his friends. His efforts to convince her that he should be allowed to see them only made her more angry. He found himself reasoning that there must be something wrong with his friends and him for selecting them as friends. That staying home with his family was the morally right thing to do, and he must be trying to be immoral by wanting to go out and see his friends. Well, later in therapy, Hector realized that this reasoning at the time was done under his mother's dark coercion. He saw how he had to conclude that she was right about everything. He also had to question and accuse himself whenever he disagreed with her. Hector felt intense grief for himself as he remembered how isolated and alone he felt throughout his adolescence. What he further mourned was that he was made to feel so alone while doing what he thought was the right thing at the time. I think Hector saved himself by caring more about what his mother thought about him than what he thought about himself. Her attacks on his character, as he disclosed in therapy, felt world-ending to him. If she was always right and she said he was a selfish or even implied he was a disgusting person, then he would feel immense amounts of self-hatred. So caring more about her thoughts about him resulted in less disagreements with her. Fewer disagreements meant less attacks on him. The cost was having to feel like he was not in charge of himself. 5 impacts of this solution on the scapegoat survivor. The scapegoat child and later the survivor cannot live their lives in the first person. They have been forbidden to think and feel freely. Doing so could have led to their instinct to flee their narcissistic parent. And again, flight from the person one needs has to be thwarted. Caring more about what the narcissistic parent thinks about the scapegoat child than what the child thinks of themselves does just that. There are several costs to the scapegoat survivor of this solution. First, the scapegoat survivor is skeptical of their own opinions, conclusions, and feelings. In order for the narcissistic parent to always be right, the scapegoat child must always be wrong. The narcissistic parent acts in ways that are hypocritical, duplicitous, vindictive, and self-promoting. The scapegoat child who sees this clearly must question those perceptions. Now that child can regard the parent as always right without as much dissonance or betraying that they kind of know the truth to the narcissistic parent. Second, nobody else's positive opinion about the scapegoat survivor can matter. There's not much room for opinions other than the narcissistic parents to the scapegoat child. The scapegoat child received positively by other people is in a pretty difficult position. This type of positive feedback conflicts with their parents' view of them. Since there can be only one person who is always right, the narcissistic parent, this child must dismiss the positive feedback. They might tell themselves, well, my friends don't really know me, or these people must be messed up if they think well of me. Third is living in an amoral world. This solution is a product of the narcissistic parent's coercion and the child's need for attachment. It's an arrangement premised on power rather than ethics. The child has to regard what is right as what makes someone else happy, and this someone else is bound by no moral code themselves. They will punish the child for offenses that may be ethical in fact, but are displeasing to that parent. So for example, Hector recalled how his mother screamed at him the most harshly when he told her not to attack his younger sister in the way she attacked him. He did something that was ethical, but was punished even more for it in the amoral world he had to inhabit with his narcissistic mother. Next is boundaries become impossible. When the scapegoat survivor has to care more about what others think of them than what they think about themselves, boundaries become very confusing. A boundary requires an initial, somewhat clear sense of who you are and who the other person is, and this solution fuzzies such an understanding. The scapegoat survivor can have difficulty knowing how they want to be treated. They have had to get used to living in a state of pain throughout their upbringing. And they did this by thinking of themselves through their narcissistic parents' eyes. They survived it. They tolerated the pain by doing this. Setting boundaries means that one can safely say what they want through their own eyes. And that often has to be developed for the scapegoat survivor. Next is it's hard or can be hard to identify narcissistic abusers today. When attachment has come to mean caring more about others' views of yourself than your own, then you may be vulnerable to narcissistic friends and or partners. Because this strategy prizes the other's claims over your own, it will be difficult or can be difficult to experience your own feelings as valid. So the hurt feelings you experience in these relationships can be and feel less important than what the other person claims. And this is exactly the scenario a child faces with a narcissistic parent. How therapy can help the scapegoat survivor live in the first person. Having to adopt this strategy reflects a severe level of narcissistic abuse. It only happens, I think, when the scapegoat child has no other option for attachment than the narcissistic parent. Insidiously, this solution can live on in the scapegoat survivor. Once adopted, it can become kind of a way of living in the world. What is ultimately needed is a relationship that does not depend on the survivor adopting the other's mind as their own. The challenge can be that the scapegoat survivor may still experience others in this way, almost at an instinctual level. Well, longer-term therapy, where the therapist affords some neutrality, I think can be particularly helpful. The goal of therapeutic neutrality is not to make a client feel alone or strange in their experience, but rather it can afford enough space in the therapeutic relationship for the client's ways of organizing their own reality to come forward. And the goal of this form of therapy is for the client to get to sort of be alone with themselves with someone else, a therapist, who is also protectively there. And this is typically a nonverbal process that takes time to develop. It's part of the ingredients of the relationship. And a different relational calculus is being introduced to the client. It's one that wholly allows them to be themselves while the therapist remains present and connected. But it may seem disorienting for a time until this new arrangement gets to be felt and appreciated. Well, back to Hector in therapy. He stayed in his for many years. His therapist's silence at the start of therapy would create a lot of anxiety for him at the start. He had such trouble focusing on himself in the presence of someone else that it just felt really distressing. He'd get overwhelmed with a feeling of being scrutinized and criticized. It would stop his ability to think, much less feel okay inside. Well, over time, Hector and his therapist traced these moments of him feeling scrutinized and criticized to him thinking critically about the therapist right beforehand. Doing so constituted a departure from the old rule of how to avoid danger, thinking that the other person was always right. To protect himself from the wrath he anticipated, he would experience himself instead as the one deserving criticism. The therapist's neutrality was important for this to be identified and understood as a feature of Hector's psychology. Now that they could both understand what was happening in these moments, Hector felt a little more free and safe to consider his own thoughts about the therapist. Bit by bit, the ways Hector had to prioritize his mother's perspective over his own began to give way. He felt it more possible to think his own thoughts in the presence of his therapist. Something different and new held them together now. Something that didn't require Hector's obedience. With this experience under his belt, he then began to seek out relationships in his life outside of therapy that afforded him something similar. Well, thank you for tuning into this week's video. I hope you found it useful in your own process of recovery. And I want to alert folks to another resource, a book that was just published on Amazon called Growing Up as the Scapegoat Child to Narcissistic Parents, A Guide to Healing. You can find the link in the description box below. If you've read it and you're so inclined to leave an honest feedback in the review section on Amazon, that would be greatly appreciated too. And with that, I just want to thank everyone again for your continued support and engagement with this channel. It's just awesome each week to read kind of what's building, has been built and continues to, I think, grow in the comments in relation to these videos. Yeah, just so incredibly meaningful to me, and I think to others as well. And with that, I look forward to posting again next Friday. Take care.